Hi, I'm Keith, and I'm not real thrilled to share a couch with Ian right now. Earlier, he spilled something on my shirt, and then I overheard him saying some comment about how pastors are socially awkward. Seriously though, whether it's a disagreement between two people or just the fact that people can be really different from each other, living in close community is hard.
You're not wrong.
But why do we feel so off when we have these sorts of moments? It's because at the deepest level of who we are wired for right relationship. We have this central human longing to know and feel and express love. We want to be in correct relationships with the people around us, and we want to do things that show that those relationships are healthy. This goes for our relationship with God, this goes for our relationship with other people, and this goes for how we look at the world and act toward goodness outside of our own walls. We call this longing to know and practice love and be in right relationship the longing for reconciliation. Reconciliation is one of the central themes in the scriptures. Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, writes about reconciliation, and he highlights two things in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. He mentions first that we have been reconciled to God through Christ. Through the example and the love and the sacrifice of Christ, we have come into right relationship with God, even when we were far off. Jesus has done that for us. The second thing Paul talks about in terms of reconciliation is that we are now agents of God's reconciliation. We are ambassadors of God in the world. So what that means is that as we love God, we then go and we help invite other people into relationship with God, and we help create right relationships in the world. The way that we relate to other people is intended to imitate the type of love that God creates and has for us, that reconciles all things. And finally, that leads us then to work in the world to make all things right. So reconciliation has everything to do with the beginning of the little fights between us, all the way to serving and caring and working for justice and peace in our world. When Jesus shares meals throughout the Gospels with all sorts of people who would not normally be permitted to eat with rabbis, he's doing something to make the world right. He's bringing people into reconciliatory relationships with himself, making things right, and then often as a result, what we see is those people go out and they've been so changed by Jesus that they do something to make the world right. Let's take a look at the final chapter of Zacchaeus' experience as he encountered Jesus and shared a meal with him.
Zacchaeus said, I'm going to give all the money, half of my money, to the poor, and I'm going to give 4 bags of money to the people who I was charging money for. And then God said, you are part of my family.
So do you see the power of reconciliation in the story of Zacchaeus? After Jesus welcomes him into his life, and after he experiences right relationship with Jesus, he's moved to create right relationship in the world through an act of radical generosity. That's what reconciliation does. It gives us the power to love well and to experience love well. Ian, come on over. Let's tell one more story. Hey, I'm sorry about getting so upset about the whole spilling stuff on my shirt and your super insensitive comment.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about spilling something on your shirt.
Moving on. So there's this story that we want to tell you about how reconciliation can really change lives and how a table can help make it happen. The Independent ran a story recently about a young, up-and-coming white supremacist leader in college.
That would be Derek Black, the son of a former KKK Grand Wizard.
When Derek was in college, one of the other students, who was a Jewish young man, invited him to a weekly Shabbat dinner with all sorts of friends from different backgrounds. He knew Derek was a white supremacist, but he invited him anyways. Eventually, he began to form relationships with all of these people at these weekly dinners, and later Derek Black would cite that these dinners were the breaking point for him to renounce his ideology of white supremacy and move toward making the world a better and more loving place rather than tearing it down with hate speech. It's not rocket science, but it actually is science. We know that eating meals together can help transform conflicts.
Len Sweet, in his book From Tablet to Table, says, "It has been proven that one of the secrets to a successful marriage and loving family is to eat before you argue. Blood sugar levels correlate with irritability and annoyance. Low glucose levels escalate tensions and heighten tempers. The same goes for the body of Christ. The secret of a loving, forgiving church is to commune before you argue. In feeding you, I forgive you."
So let's take a look at the whiteboard to get the big picture on reconciliation. Okay, let's talk about the Venn diagram of reconciliation. When you use Venn diagrams, you always look smarter, so pro tip, use Venn diagrams. In the scriptures, what we see God working to reconcile things on multiple levels. The first one is between God and people. There's this desire for God to make relationships right, to forgive, to welcome in, to walk side by side, like the Garden of Eden's original image is, and like Jesus does with his disciples and those that he comes in contact with. Of course, the second idea then is right relationships between people. God gives us what we talked about earlier, the ministry of reconciliation, which means that we work with each other to make relationships that are founded on peace and love and care. Anytime that there is not something right in our relationships, God designs us to be able to make them right. Finally, we have this image of creation. Now, right relationships in creation or reconciliation between people and the world might look like caring for the environment and caring for God's earth. But it might also look like dealing with systems of oppression or injustice that aren't right. So when we do all of these things, when we participate in reconciliation with God, reconciliation with people, and reconciliation with the whole world and all of creation, then what we move toward is the biblical word called shalom. That means that the world is at peace, things are as they should be, and we are walking with God in the right direction now and forever. All right, we are learning how to get along and make the world better. Let's figure out some core practices for reconciliation.
Be humble learners.
We all look at the world through our own lens. When we're unaware that we have a bias, and everyone has a certain bias, then it becomes more difficult for us to understand other people who see the world through other lenses, formed by their family of origin or their perspective in any number of ways. The way that we can help get past that is by just simply asking the honest question and saying, "Help me understand." This is the first step toward reconciliation.
Make gracious assumptions.
We don't all have to be the same in order to dwell together in love and move toward understanding. When we make gracious assumptions, we acknowledge that there might be something beyond what we see at first or beyond what we think that we know. There's a difference between unity and uniformity. We don't all have to be the same to be unified, and when we can agree on that, that's when we can move forward.
Have courageous conversations.
This one's really difficult, but when we're willing to actually do the hard work of asking the questions or of saying that we are sorry or of having whatever the tough conversation might be to understand and reconcile with one another, that's when we finally become a real community. You can live on the surface the entire time and avoid all difficult conversations, but you'll never actually be transformed in that kind of a setting. It doesn't always work like we want it to, though. Here are some of the trip-ups that get in the way of having a culture of reconciliation.
Being shaped more by culture than by Jesus.
Our allegiance is to Jesus and nobody else. It's not to another political party, it's not to an ideology, it's not to anything. And so when we begin to listen to news stations or read websites or listen to radio in any way that shapes us more than Jesus, it's going to lead us to pessimism or to cynicism or to looking at someone as the other in a way that will never lead to reconciliation. We have to take our cues from Jesus first and let that lead us to engage with other people in a meaningful way and a way that doesn't label them.
Pretending everything's fine.
This can have an impact in both personal and larger ways in how we see the world. If there's some sort of a conflict that arises, even within your own family, but certainly within your own meal community, sweeping it under the rug or acting like it's no problem doesn't get us anywhere. Our avoidance of these issues can cause us to actually create barriers between ourselves and others. Additionally, if we are in positions where we look around the world and we tell ourselves that everything is fine, and this is most easy for those of us that are in positions of dominant culture or privilege of some sort, we actually make it harder to be able to hear people who say everything isn't fine. We need to learn to listen to the people who say everything isn't fine so that we can work toward reconciliation.
What happens in meal community stays in meal community.
Reconciliation is about more than just making up after a fight. Like we said earlier in this video, it's about making the world as it should be, partnering with Jesus in the renewal of all things. So when meal communities spend most of their time just talking about their own lives and never actually talking about what it means to make the world a better place, to partner with Jesus in loving all people and transforming systems of oppression and violence and injustice, then what we end up doing is we end up having a very, very small view of reconciliation. God is doing something in the world and inviting us to partner with it. Let's not forget that when we talk about reconciling the world and reconciling with one another. So after you've gotten done fighting about everything we just talked about, you can take a look at these questions to have some dialogue in your meal community. What does it look like for you to create a culture of reconciliation when and where you meet?
Jewish and Gentile cultures were completely different. Brainstorm some of the challenges they face as the early church became more inclusive of different peoples and cultures.
Hint, look at the book of Acts.
What ground rules are necessary for our group to be a place of reconciliation? Where do I sense an opportunity for my own growth in this area, both within the meal community and extending to the rest of the world?